You are Parag Khanna of the New America Foundation, right? And I want to start out. I've never done this before, but I'm gonna. You want to play Name That Tune? I'm gonna play a song and see if you can recognize it.
Okay, I'm guessing the tune is probably okay. Yeah.
Here we go.
Right.
You got that?
Yup.
You know that song?
Yeah, and other than one word in the title, there you go. Everybody wants to rule the world. And most people have confused the title of this book with that song. And if only my publisher would include a soundtrack, we could have really set the record straight. But,
your song, your book is called How to Run the World, right?
It is indeed. It is indeed.
Yeah. And did you ponder calling it Rule the World? You must have gone through that deliberation, right? Rule, run.
Well, it's a great question to start because, quite frankly, I never did. This book was always going to be how to run the world because run is the operative word. It's a book against the idea of rule. Rule connotes some kind of top-down management structure or even perhaps some kind of military approach or, worst of all, some kind of silver bullet answer to ruling the world in a one-off kind of way. In fact, that's the exact opposite of what this book is about. The reason I chose the word run is because run connotes some kind of process or system of management that is ongoing. And that's what diplomacy is supposed to be. And because this is a book about diplomacy, first and foremost, I call it How to Run the World, because diplomacy is that system of management for world affairs. So never was the book going to be anything but how to run the world.
Okay. Now, as you may know, one difference between Blogging Heads TV and NPR is that on Blogging Heads TV, we don't even pretend that we've read the guy's book.
Right.
So why don't you start out, and I'm not saying I won't, but, the night is young. The book just came out recently. Why don't you tell me why?
And you already know everything anyway, so I'm not sure why you would have to read it per se.
I wouldn't go quite that far. But why don't you tell me why I should read your book?
Well, someone should read this book because I think every time we turn on the news or open the newspaper, we see crisis after crisis, whether it's a Japanese earthquake, tsunami, nuclear meltdown combo, or whether it is, of course, everything that's happening right now in the Middle East in terms of the cascading uprisings that are happening. This is a book that really tells you why we have such a poor ability to respond to these crises. It's because we have a very bad diplomatic system. And so anyone can pile up phenomenon after phenomenon of crisis after crisis and say, oh, look, things aren't going so well. This is a book that really presents why some of these things are happening and what a better diplomatic model would look like to manage these crises.
Okay, so I guess the obvious question is, what would that model look like? What's the big difference between what the world is doing now in a vain attempt to run itself well, or an unsuccessful attempt, and the approach you would recommend?
Well, this book basically turns our entire model of what an evolved system of global governance is or should be on its head. We have sort of been trained to believe that evolution in world politics comes in the form of having ever more centralized and powerful entities like the United Nations system, the World Bank, Bretton Woods system, NATO, maybe the G20, World Trade Organization, whatever the case may be. This is a book that flips all of that on its head and says that better global governance would be better local governance, and that what we would do to achieve more stability in the world is to push resources outward away from centralized institutions towards a much more diffuse kind of model in which empowerment happens at the local level, global resources go to local solutions, and a wide variety of actors, most importantly, are involved in diplomacy, not just governments. I think we've reached the maximal extent of what will happen by way of interstate, intergovernmental cooperation to solve global problems, and we have obviously not been very pleased or satisfied by the result. This is a book that says there is a far greater set of resources on the table if you look at the world of non-governmental actors, corporations, and so forth. But there's absolutely no diplomatic model that encompasses those different actors. And so what I do is lay that out problem by problem, whether it's climate change or failed states or counterterrorism or poverty. There is what I call mega diplomacy, one that includes .gov, .com, .org, and even .god, religious actors, all of them in new kinds of coalitions.
And let me ask for you to get a little concrete. I mean, is there something you can pluck from the recent headlines where you would have done things differently than they were in fact done?
Well, with the emphasis on focusing on local or regional resources, if you look at the way in which the United States has worked with the African Union, for example, and the Europeans have too, to create a peaceful settlement of the situation in South Sudan, or a referendum transition process towards the independence of that country, and how peacefully that was done, I think that's a remarkable example of supporting the local actors, meaning the government of South Sudan, negotiating with them. Private actors were also involved, such as Independent Diplomat, which is an NGO that was the diplomatic advisor of the government of South Sudan. So you had public and private actors, you had global resources or global powers supporting the regional organization, and you had a very relatively peaceful creation of a new country. I don't think that we should lose sight of that accomplishment, even despite all of the drama and the headlines in the Middle East today, especially since we may need that again. A big chunk of this book talks about the creation of new states, self-determination, issues like Kurdistan, Palestine, and so forth that aren't going away, and the ways in which looking at the local power structures is going to be more important than just having some kind of top-down solution imposed from the outside.
Hey, Palestine, that would be a great problem to solve. I mean, if you can do that, I will definitely run out and buy your book. If you can, in the next few minutes, convince me that you've got the solution there, Parag. Go ahead. The stage is yours.
Well, like I said, this mega diplomacy is about bringing public actors, state actors, together with non-state actors. If you look at what happened last week, a new political party was launched called the New Palestine Party. And what is their platform? Their platform is pushing for foreign investment from around the region, around the world, to help finance the Rand Corporation's proposal for an ARC, which is an infrastructure corridor linking the West Bank and Gaza. What that demonstrates is that you have to have an infrastructure strategy, an economic strategy, and all of these things that can't be delivered just by having rose garden ceremonies between governments. In fact, you actually have to have the kind of foreign investment, infrastructure development, and these kinds of actors involved that really aren't traditionally considered part of diplomacy if you actually want to have a territorial resolution to that situation.
Okay, let me give you a little pushback. At first, I actually think there's been a little more emphasis in the last few years on building an economy for the future Palestinian state. And I don't know if it's all been done in accordance with your recommendations. But the other thing is, it seems like you can kind of do that all day long, but there is this, as I recall, territorial dispute that there seems to be no clear solution to, right? I mean, there is not, it doesn't seem plausible, given the politics of Israel, that a whole lot of the settlements are actually ever going to end. In fact, they are growing. I don't understand how the involvement, a little more investment in Palestine or something is going to change that. But maybe...
Yeah, Bob, let's bear in mind, though, the purpose here is not to argue that state efforts are futile and that everything needs to be left to market forces and investors and NGO saviors. That's not the argument here. The argument is about combining these resources more intelligently. The fact that only in the last couple of years have people talked about an economic strategy for Palestine is precisely the problem that I'm addressing here. I'm not saying that none of this has ever been done. I'm saying that it's a pity that it hasn't been done sooner. Let's also take the example of Afghanistan as we come towards the 10th anniversary of our occupation and military presence there. Why is it that it took so long for, in this case, the Pentagon to come up with an Office of Business and Stability Operations and to start to bring in the American private sector to think about how you would connect a landlocked country into supply chains and invest in infrastructure so that it could have a sustainable economy that serves the region more broadly and can generate stability in that way? It took 10 years to get to that point, realizing that you have to bring in private actors and have partnerships among public and private actors. I just got an email today from the Department of Commerce saying, we see in your book that you write a lot about the reinsurance sector. We've realized that we need to get the reinsurance sector much more involved in stimulating economic growth in different countries and creating the conditions for, or what the World Bank calls an enabling environment for foreign investment to generate growth, to build political stability. Why did they send me that email? Why did the Department of Commerce email me about something I wrote about corporations? Because our U.S. government is realizing that they have to work in a much closer partnership with companies if they want to actually achieve their foreign policy objectives, even if those fall into categories like security or poverty or environment. I don't view these categories as all that static and distinct from one another. That's precisely the problem. I spend the early part of this book bashing the various silos, governmental silos and silos at the United Nations and other agencies that don't treat these problems in an interdisciplinary way.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now you mentioned the turmoil in the Middle East, by which I guess you mean the Arab Spring or the Arab Revolt or whatever you want to call it. Let's take an example involving global governance. Libya. It has come to involve global governance recently with the action by the United Nations, and I should say that this will not air for at least several days, maybe a week after we tape. So there's a chance that either of us could say things that make us look stupid by the time it comes out if we get predictive or anything. But why don't you tell me whether you said that. You kind of spoke negatively about the conception of global governance that emphasizes strong, centralized institutions. You mentioned the United Nations. Well, in this Libya case, the UN actually wound up playing a strong role, although the regional organizations, of which I think you think highly, or at least think they should play a large role. Also, a regional organization was also central. Apparently, if the Arab League hadn't gone along, this UN resolution wouldn't have happened. But in any event, you know how it played out, right? We got a UN resolution that authorized the use of force, and the use of force has proceeded. Now, as we speak, the use of force has at least arguably been consistent with the mandate of that UN resolution. There's now there may be some concern now or down the road that the coalition is exceeding the authorization, going beyond the protection of civilians and explicitly just aiding the rebels and so on. But leave that aside. Let's leave the question of of compliance with the mandate aside, and just tell me what you thought of that as an exercise in global governance.
Well, for one thing, I thought it was very promising that Obama and all the signals they sent was that the Europeans have made certain decisions about recognizing the National Council, in other words, the rebels of the eastern part of Libya, as a legitimate government, and that they are proceeding accordingly. Also, regional organizations such as NATO, of course, were involved, in the African Union, which you mentioned, the Arab League as well, which you mentioned. I think it's a positive sign, again, when powerful Western actors are making sure that the things that they're doing have some amount of local legitimacy or regional buy-in. And of course, as you know, the UAE, Qatar, and a couple of other Arab countries have been involved. Egypt has as well, given that it's Libya's neighbor. All of this, I think, is very promising in terms of looking at how, rather than an outside-driven kind of approach, you have global resources, global decision-making, being consistent with what local priorities and preferences are. So I think so far things have gone well. Let me point out, though, because I have a section of this book on assassinations, and I'm someone who spent a bit of time in Libya and wrote a chapter of my last book on Libya. I think that all of this could have happened a lot more quickly, and I think that we are heading towards a situation, a showdown, one way or the other, where someone is actually going to kill Qaddafi. It may be Western airstrike, it may be our support for rebel groups because we've helped them march back westward to take Tripoli or towards Tripoli and so forth. But anyone who's ever spent even a day in Libya knows very well that Qaddafi is not a man who is going to take a villa in the south of France like a Ben Ali or a Mubarak or whatever the case may be. In fact, you will eventually have to kill him. Either you directly kill him or you support those who will kill him.
Well, he might settle. He might settle for partition, but with that in parentheses, go ahead.
Sure, exactly. And I'm not so sure that he would necessarily either, because I don't think that you would have a stable partition with him still in power in the West. Therefore, he's not.
Well, if he didn't have enough oil in his part of the partition, he wouldn't like it. But anyway, all of this will probably be irrelevant by the time people see this. So go ahead. Sorry.
But I just want to. Well, hopefully it will be irrelevant. Let's see what happens in the next couple of days. The point is, though, that we saw that he stayed, that he fought, that he dug in his heels, that a lot of massacres and mayhem have occurred in the meantime, and that it would have been a lot faster to probably undertake some kind of assassination attempt against him.
Okay. So wait, this is interesting. So you think who should have undertaken the assassination attempt?
Well, this is where global governance comes in, because if you look at the way in which international humanitarian law has evolved, things like the responsibility to protect and so forth, there is a logic by which you could say this person represents a threat to international peace and stability. It is a high probability that he is going to use whatever resources are at his disposal to conduct a very vicious murderous attacks on his own people and take no prisoners and cause immense amounts of damage, and therefore there is some justification for some kind of targeted attack against him. Now, I'm not saying that...
Now, this would go through the Security Council and everything? I mean, you would want to give this the full force of international law and have the Security Council authorize the assassination?
Well, the Security Council is still, in fact, the United Nations is still in the process as we speak of reviewing whether or not the conditions have been met in terms of his having conducted crimes against humanity in the last several weeks. The problem is it's taking a long time to come to that decision. Now, we have sitting heads of state that have been indicted by the International Criminal Court, as you know. Omar Bashir of Sudan is the sitting president of Sudan, and he has been indicted by the International Criminal Court. There's a case
But global bodies have never, I mean, like the ICC or the Security Council have never said, okay, assassinate him. I just want to be clear. Is that what you're saying should be a part of the procedure of international law?
No, because
that should actually happen.
No, as you know, I'm against the centralization of authorities as such into global bodies. I don't think there needs to be a standby militia of assassins sitting at the behest of Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General. All that does.
Okay, so who should make the decision? Who should make the decision to assassinate him and then assassinate him?
I'm saying that whoever does actually do the assassination, it can be justified by certain aspects of international law that are in evolution today. That's the point. Who actually pulls the trigger may depend on a secret deal between, say, Arab leaders and saying, okay, we would like you to do this, but we're not going to pass some kind of public resolution about it, and they would authorize or invite even some actors such as the United States to do it, but perhaps done in such a way where it's not really clear who did it or how, so that it doesn't appear to rain on the parade of the rebels who have been, valiantly fighting to take back their country. So there's any number of ways in which this could be done. I'm saying that global governance, to the extent it can be efficient, could at least be a legitimizing vehicle for local actors to make these kinds of to take these kinds of actions with international support.
But there would not be explicit validation in your scenario because the person who's doing the assassinating would not even do it. I mean, this seems a little dangerous to me, the idea that you're saying, well, if anybody anywhere thinks that a ruler should be assassinated, and you probably can justify it in some vague sense by international law, well, God bless you. I mean...
Well, the purpose of international law is not to justify things in a vague sense. That's certainly how we tend to use international law, as you know very well, when it comes to the invasion of Iraq and so forth. I'm not talking about using vague elliptical phrases or loopholes in international law. I'm talking about looking at how, every day of the year, even when there isn't a crisis going on in the Middle East, there is an effort underway to actually make far more stringent and applicable international humanitarian law, such that non-state actors, for example, are included, such that there's a much quicker and more concrete process of determining what constitute crimes against humanity and so forth, and that if this trigger were more quickly and readily measured or measurable or assessed, that local actors could be more justified in taking decisions like this. I'm not talking about someone shooting from the hip and deciding whether or not they feel Qaddafi is a bad guy.
Well, okay, but then you must be talking about explicit authorization. I mean, either people shoot for the hip and argue that it's consistent with international law, or you have a body that makes the decision as to whether it would be consistent with international law. I don't see a third possibility, right?
There can be, yes, you could have, for example, again, you could have the International Criminal Court determining whether or not an assassination would be justified.
Right. And that's what you would do. You think the ICC should authorize assassinations?
I'm saying they could authorize assassinations. They already indict heads of state, among other people, war criminals like Joseph Kony of the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda as well. State and non-state actors have been indicted for war crimes by the International Criminal Court. After such point in time, it is certainly conceivable that those individuals become the target of assassination attempts.
Well, okay, but in national law, an indictment is not a conviction. We would never, institute the death penalty because someone is indicted for murder, right? And so I'm a little confused.
You're saying that yes, there is an indictment, but there isn't a conviction, meaning there isn't an explicit authorization saying now we assign XYZ body or country to conduct this assassination.
No, it isn't. It isn't just that. There hasn't even been a determination of guilt by the ICC when it's only indicted someone. No, much less of the authorization of punishment. There hasn't even been guilt established in a formal way.
Right, exactly. Especially since these people, such as, with the exception of Milosevic, or taking the example of Bashir, they don't actually show up to trial, so they're indicted in absentia. Yes.
Well, I mean, indictment would not, even if they weren't indicted in absentia, indictment would still not be conviction. So
right,
I just
so
want to be clear. But you're saying indictment for a war crime is sufficient grounds for someone to take it upon themselves to assassinate?
I would say that, yeah. I would also say, though, that it's a case-by-case situation. Again, one thing that you have to take into account is that, in fact, as these deliberations began to be discussed and undertaken, we hadn't seen Qaddafi do certain things that he obviously has done in between, such as some of the destructive activities and raids and shelling of cities and so forth. What I'm saying is that you could certainly have known that he was going to do those things, that he was not going to take some kind of golden parachute, and therefore the time at which to have supported the rebels explicitly would have actually been early on in the conflict, even if that had not been, quite frankly, something that had been immediately considered and adjudicated and determined by the International Criminal Court or by the Security Council. If you do remember the Kosovo operation very well, and the one phrase that sticks coming out of that was that it was illegal but legitimate. I certainly believe that an attempt to take out Qaddafi when the going was good for the rebels in the very first week of the uprising there would have been justified.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Even if done explicitly by a single nation state, I mean overtly by a single nation state.
Yes, but I mean, it's up to the nations involved to determine whether they're doing it overtly or covertly. At this point now, we are taking actions against him. We have, in fact, bombed his compound, and yet publicly we're saying, oh no, we do not have any authorization or any orders to directly target President Qaddafi, right? I mean, Colonel Qaddafi.
Yeah, but actually, wait, just for clarity, I'm not sure we bombed the residential part of his compound. His compound is like a university campus, and I believe what we targeted were military or security sites.
Correct, yes.
My
point is that we are making public statements saying that we don't have any plans to take him out, and maybe we don't at this point in time. But of course, we shouldn't be saying that we do anyway. But if we did, I think it would be justified.
Yeah. Well, I certainly think that what we're not saying and are in fact doing is that we're basically giving the rebels military support. Which goes beyond the protection of, and which is frankly where I start getting uncomfortable. But where this isn't about me. So let's move to some other issue areas. But first, let's step back into your assessment of the situation. And I think part of your view is that the modern world is more like the medieval world than, say, the world was 50 years ago, right?
Yeah, and there's many reasons why I have taken this framing. One thing is, of course, you hear a lot of people saying that medieval, or rather the 21st century multipolarity has analogies to 19th century, the European experience. That's why you have people saying America needs to learn from Bismarck and so forth. I find that incredibly shallow, narrow, and actually fairly irrelevant, because that 21st century multipolarity is very global in nature. It isn't simply a replication of the 19th century continental European experience. It is multipolar, it is multi-civilizational. The period of history that I look for, actually, for guidance is, in fact, the Middle Ages. The reason is because that, too, was, at least in the Eurasian context, a multipolar, multi-civilizational landscape. Song Dynasty China was the most advanced civilization of the age. The Chola Dynasty of India was a strong naval power. The Arab Islamic caliphates, the Abbasid and Umayyad Caliphate stretched from North Africa to Central Asia. Europe was divided and weak between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, but it was most certainly a medieval, multipolar landscape in which no one power was able to dominate over the others. That's the structural analogy. The fact that structure means we have the number of powers that we have, and that was a multipolar world, and today too is a multipolar world. But the other part of the picture, which is extremely important and so widely neglected by people who work in the geopolitical field today, who talk about rising powers, is the systems change, not just the structural change. Everyone appreciates that we're moving away from one superpower towards multiple powers. Systems change means you also have different kinds of units involved in diplomacy and in global governance and geopolitics today. You have corporations, you have NGOs, you have terrorist groups, you have religious actors. All of these are also part that landscape of power. One recent study by, I think, Fletcher University, Fletcher School, shows that there's something like 13,000 armed militia groups in the world. We all know how many thousands of multinational corporations there are, how many fairly autonomous NGOs there are, and so forth. So you have to appreciate systems change if you want to appreciate, I think, the complexity of the 21st century. And again, the medieval world, the pre-Westphalian world, was also a time when the church, of course, but also city-states, city units, companies, trade associations, universities, merchant guilds, and so forth were also an important part of governance. And so to me, for those two reasons, the structural reason and the systems reason, the medieval period is a very good analogy to what we're heading into in the 21st century.
Yeah, I didn't realize that you meant, when you talk about the medieval world, that you actually meant the whole planet, because... And that the multipolarity you're referring to is kind of Asia on the one hand, Europe on the other. And I guess what I would ask is, but was that really a world? In other words, how often did Europe really care what was going on in Asia? I mean, Europe's universe during the medieval times was, for the most part, Europe or areas immediately around Europe, right?
Right, but Bob, this is exactly the point. When people say Middle Ages, people in the Western world only think of their own Dark Ages. They're not obviously thinking immediately of the fact that it was the Arab world's Golden Age and China's Golden Age. So the whole point is that there was such a thing as the world. I don't really care whether or not in any particular Western European place someone was appreciating the marvels of China. Of course, that's exactly what Marco Polo.
No.
That's exactly
I understand
what
all
Marco
that.
Polo
I understand. No, I understand that the whole planet existed, and I understand that Chinese civilization existed. My point is that it was not a kind of continuous field of political interaction. In other words, governance questions did not arise at the level of the world because Europe was not interacting with Asia the way it is today. That's what I'm saying.
You are exactly right. There was no global governance, of course, per se then. But that is what is so interesting is that, in fact, with the commercial revolution in the High Middle Ages, and of course the formation of regular trade routes such as the Silk Road, you actually finally started to see the birth of long-range transcontinental commerce for the first time. So in fact, I labeled that period, the first Middle Ages, I labeled it globalization 1.0. And the fact that there was this regular communication and exchange across those cultures was a really good example of how, in fact, East-West connections, connectivity, and globalization really started to concretely take shape. So it's actually a very instructive period of history. Now, of course, due to technology and the intensity of relations across civilizations today, obviously we are at globalization 5.0, if anything. We're well beyond that early phase. But there was, in fact, the discovery of the other and the rest of the world, and interactions, regular interactions, at precisely that time. That's what makes it so fascinating.
Okay. So let's move to another area in global governance where there's a kind of centralized body that I would say is doing good and should if anything become a little more powerful. It's in some respects the World Trade Organization. As you know, 20, 30 years ago there was no World Trade Organization. There was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. There was the agreement about what tariffs should be, but there was no mechanism of enforcement. Now with the World Trade Organization, there isn't a firm mechanism of enforcement, but there is now formal adjudication of trade disputes and the authorization of retaliatory measures when a nation's grievance is deemed to be valid, right? Now, it seems to me that's kind of a good thing to prevent open trade wars. How do you feel about that part of what the WTO is doing?
Bob, I'm so glad you brought up the WTO. In this book is portrayed as the most successful single international body in the history of the world, and it has many virtues to it. For one thing, it has done a tremendous job since its origins as the GATT in reducing global trade, tariffs on average something like 80 to 90% in the last 60 years. So it has been absolutely remarkable. It is also a model relative to other UN agencies or UN-related bodies, Bretton Woods bodies, and so forth, of being relatively small, light footprint, very small bureaucracy, not a huge overhead. And what is more, it also has what you were describing, which is the dispute resolution mechanism. It actually has adjudication procedures, retaliatory measures, and so forth. So it is in so many ways a truly model intergovernmental body. Now, what's interesting about it, though, is a couple of things. First of all, it succeeded a great deal, but as you know, since the Doha round was announced, a decade ago, it has actually been stalled. It hasn't progressed. Now, people have tended to believe that because of that, there was going to be de-globalization or reversal of globalization, stalling of globalization. And yet those things have not happened. Why is that? It's because there is an organic interest in pursuing globalization on the part of countries that are involved in it, governments that are driving policy, companies that are seeking to expand, supply chains that are growing, and so forth. So globalization has continued, trade has boomed, trade volume has increased on an interregional basis, a bilateral basis, all of these ways without WTO negotiations having progressed. So the WTO has been so vital, indispensable in creating a baseline for globalization to continue and emerge and deepen and widen, but it started to do so without the WTO actively managing that process, because the WTO has simply set rules that participants have agreed to. I think it is a marvelous organization, I really do. Now, what we're seeing, though, is that obviously there are some hiccups. Intellectual property protection, to name just one, labor standards, environmental standards, all of these things are basically stalled, frozen, probably dead. The WTO may never ever manage to advance in really systemic ways ever again. But that said, it's really done a tremendous amount of good.
Okay, and let me sketch out a possible future evolutionary path for the WTO that I'm guessing you would not favor. You can imagine. And this gets us into other areas of global governance, but there are other areas where you would like to get nations to chip in for the benefit of international security. So, for example, nuclear non-proliferation or something. Then there's the environment where you would like to incentivize nations to do the right thing in the environment. But let's take proliferation. What if you said that, look, the WTO, if you're a member of the WTO, you're getting these benefits of this regime of trade, and if you're going to benefit from the world economy and the work that's being done to make it stable and orderly, you should play a role in keeping the world orderly. And so we're going to say that every member of the WTO, for example, has to open up to inspections for nuclear arms or something like that, just generically, that kind of prerequisite. You would be against that, probably, right?
Well, I mean, for one thing, retroactively, adding on aspects of WTO membership or conditions of membership when that membership is already nearly universal, to be adding things on there is obviously not going to be is not going to work. It's not going to fly. No one is going to approve that. So I don't think that's really feasible to begin with. I mean, I think I support your lofty goal of linking issues. I do think issues need to be linked in important ways. I'm not so sure about trade and proliferation, but your question does open up a very important sort of line of reasoning that I think we in the West have to appreciate as we seek to evolve these institutions. A lot of people don't really believe around the world that we are somehow a force for counterproliferation and that we need other countries to help shoulder the burden of counterproliferation. When countries look at the U.S.-India nuclear deal and the U.S.-UAE nuclear agreement, they don't really see some kind of well-negotiated arrangement that is controlling the spread of nuclear proliferation in a way that is somehow demonstrates the good stewardship of the United States. Right. I'm sure you're familiar with that position.
I totally agree that they don't see that in our policy.
Right. So I think you need to be very careful about assuming that burden sharing equals the notion that we have to somehow get others on board with our architecture. I mean, this is obviously a long-running debate that I and other people have with people like John Eikenberry at Princeton. For Eikenberry and others, the membership membership and participation in Western institutions connotes an endorsement of everything those institutions do and the ways in which the West has built that scaffolding of world order in which they participate, and that therefore they must burden share within it. Quite frankly, it's very clear that what China and other countries do is join the WTO precisely so they can gain the benefits, but also seek to undermine aspects of that agenda that they don't really like. And therefore, we face the difficulty of having to cede some leadership in these organizations towards those new members. And that's really the way the rest of the world, I think, views it.
Okay, I'm not sure I followed all that. So what would your approach be to nuclear non-proliferation? I mean, it doesn't seem to me to have been wildly successful. It hasn't, things could have gone a lot more badly. There could be a lot more nuclear weapons, but the fact is the idea of the non-proliferation treaty in the early 1960s was to keep the nuclear powers down to 5, and it's gone well beyond that, and it looks like it could go further. So what would you recommend in that area?
Right, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a non-proliferation treaty. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a comprehensive test ban treaty. Obviously, we have those mechanisms, and they are good. The question is, do we have mechanisms of enforcement that potentially allow for regional organizations to carry out the kind of monitoring and oversight and inspections that might be more palatable to countries within a region? So Steve Clemens and I, support the ASEAN Regional Forum approach to building transparency within East Asia, which is to say you have a far more regional-driven type of effort to have reporting on military activity, on armaments industry, on nuclear proliferation, and things like this on a regional level, because you can also at the same time institute confidence-building measures that don't really exist on a global level. So that's I think that proliferation also is a regional problem and needs to have a regional dimension to it. Also, I write in this book about the Proliferation Security Initiative. There's an example of a coalition of countries that came together to interdict, for example, suspected shipments of nuclear material internationally, and its only justification or legitimation is one UN Security Council resolution. And so there, you didn't create a new organization to manage global proliferation. You didn't create a World Proliferation Organization or a World Environment Organization. You simply had one resolution authorizing countries to implement existing codes and rules. And so I think that there's a number of things going on in the counterproliferation area that could in combination be successful, but they aren't all global or centralized in nature, not at all.
But do you think the centralized version, that is the non-proliferation treaty, being the premier one, needs revision and enhancement, or you're fine with it?
I mean, there's obviously people have been arguing for a long time that the NPT needs to be revised, it needs to be stronger, greater enforcement mechanisms, kind of also obviously recognizing those new nuclear powers rather than being this sort of, a club of the powerful and advantaged and so forth. So I would say there's a mix of rhetorical changes that a lot of countries are demanding and also functional changes that people are demanding. Of course, the rhetorical changes are coming from the new nuclear powers or nuclear aspirants, whereas the functional reforms in terms of giving it more teeth for inspections and intrusion and so forth come from the nuclear club. And that's the deadlock that hasn't been broken right now. I don't know if we ever will break that deadlock, which is why I support kind of, ad hoc instruments like Proliferation Security Initiative and other things to get the job done.
I mean, do you really think they're up to it? I mean, I don't see any signs that they are.
Who's the they? I'm sorry, who do you mean?
These decentralized approaches. Do you think that amalgam of regional and other efforts and kind of the Proliferation Security Initiative, which doesn't involve nations really agreeing to cede any sovereignty or any greater oversight of their facilities or anything. Do you really think those are up to the task?
Well, I mean, you yourself pointed out that we've done a pretty good job of controlling proliferation, and the situation could be a lot worse right now. So, I tend to agree with you, in fact, that the various control mechanisms and deterrence itself have played a very important role in limiting proliferation. So, the question as to whether or not ad hoc mechanisms are up to the task. Again, look at the look at the analogies to other areas. If you're looking at peace and security more broadly, does global peace and security really hinge on whether we reform the UN Security Council? Well, it hasn't been reformed in 30 years, has it? It hasn't been expanded. And obviously, just like other bodies we've been talking about, many countries consider it a club of the sort of self-righteous nuclear powers. But people don't consider it legitimate because it's not representative. They don't consider it effective because it isn't efficient, and it hasn't responded, the Libya case notwithstanding, to crises such as Darfur and other sorts of things. So should we be waiting forever for there to be a reform of the UN Security Council of NPT? I certainly don't think so. I'm not holding my breath.
No, but I don't think that's really the question. I mean, to say that reform is in order and would be good is not to say that in the meanwhile we shouldn't do what we can in other venues to solve problems. It seems to me these are two separate questions.
Right, but I think they're both playing out at the same time. Again, if you look at the broader security area, my support for regional organizations is such that I believe, and by the way, I don't think that the U.S. and EU get enough credit for the fact that they have provided, billions of dollars worth of support to the African Union so that they could stand up a peacekeeping force of their own that has conducted operations in Somalia, Uganda, and elsewhere. I think that that's a very good example of strengthening regional security mechanisms so that eventually you don't have to wait for a gridlock security council to authorize certain kinds of peacekeeping interventions and so forth. Regional stability mechanisms, regional security guarantees, mechanisms like the Union of South American Nations, the African Union, the European Union, the Arab League, and ASEAN are all, to me, a more peaceful world is not one in which the UN Security Council is simply bigger and probably more inefficient. A more stable world is one in which there are more competent security organizations that arbitrate their own internal affairs and don't require external interventions.
Yeah, I'm in favor of that, although I would say that the regional organizations are not just an alternative to the Security Council. In the case of Libya, what we saw was that the gridlock that you referred to in the Security Council was probably broken by the voice of a regional organization. I think if the Arab League hadn't gone along with that, hadn't asked for the no-fly zone, might well not have happened. So regional organizations can also help legitimize, make more likely action by the Security Council and help legitimize it in the eyes of people who would otherwise dismiss it as a club of five
Absolutely, and I'm glad you point out that it's a two-way street. That's an essential part of the argument as to why they are so important.
Yeah. Okay. Now, finally, before we wrap up, let's move to a wholly different area, the environment. The old-fashioned, the traditional argument with which you may take issue, I don't know, for kind of comprehensive treaties, possibly involving a centralized mechanism for enforcement, was that environment is a classic non-zero-sum problem where there are these negative externalities. It's a collective action problem, let's say, where it's not in the interest of any one nation to make the sacrifice, say, that would reduce global warming or any other kind of problem, unless other nations agree to bear their share of the burden. And so the argument was, well, then you have to get everyone together, as complicated as that may be, and get them to sign a treaty where they will symmetrically contribute to a solution to the problem. Maybe the classic example is fluorocarbons, or was it chlorofluorocarbons, or something like that. The stuff that ate away the ozone layer. There was a successful treaty, the Montreal Protocol, where very much that kind of thing happened, right? Everybody got together and said, I think everybody, certainly a lot of people got together and said, okay, we will ban aerosols if you will, or whatever the details are. Now, so talk about that, whether this solution is adequate or is even needed.
Yeah, I actually have a chapter about this in this book because, it is obviously the Montreal Protocol is a very important landmark treaty in the history of environmental diplomacy and a universal regulatory mechanism. However, it did take about 14 years to actually negotiate. And I think by most people's logic, we don't really have 14 years again to deal with this, with climate change. So there are some differences between the ways in which also the sources of those sources of CFCs were different from obviously the broad-based sources that contribute to climate change. So for a lot of reasons, doing climate change diplomacy today, especially with a far greater number of influential emitting countries and powers, is a lot harder than what was done with the Montreal Protocol. So I have a lot of concern, in fact, that we have undertaken this repetition of a centralized approach that began with Kyoto and has gone through Bali and Copenhagen and Cancun, and you pick the next sunny resort where some big climate change summit is going to take place. I'm not a fan, I have to be perfectly blunt with you, of these kinds of this approach. It is not working. You will never have China, India, and other countries actually make sign on to universal binding greenhouse gas reduction treaties unless they actually have the technological capacity to do so. So in this book, I put much more weight on technological innovation, again, mega diplomacy, empowering the private sector, subsidizing innovation, technology transfer mechanisms like the Clean Development Mechanism that the World Bank has, or the Major Emitters Forum that actually the Bush administration started, and a whole set of efforts such as even the Clinton initiative's C40 initiative that involves 40 mayors of the 40 largest emitting cities in the world. Things like JUICE, the Joint U.S.-China Collaboration on Clean Energy, which actually has clean tech companies in the United States going to China, working with mayors and factory owners subsidized by the Chinese government. You have a whole set of actors involved in there that are actually tangibly contributing to reduced emissions. The only justification that most people have today for why we have these huge climate summits where thousands of people fly in and burn lots of emissions to get there is that they quote-unquote keep momentum going. That is utter nonsense. You do not need those summits to take place to keep the momentum going. I think
but is it the case that you just think as a practical matter we're never going to get these global treaties, or that even if we could, that wouldn't be the way to go? Is largely a practical problem for you, or
the problem to me is so deeply psychological, Bob? It's the very notion that a single global treaty is the benchmark for whether or not we're making progress, rather than whether or not we are actually reducing emissions by changing the composition of the economies and the technology that those economies have access to in a very concrete, tangible way. To me, getting a treaty would be like the icing on the cake, because it's not going to happen until those countries are actually well on the path to achieving what it would say anyway. It's like saying that poverty reduction has happened because the UN passed the Millennium Development Goals, which, as you know, gets it all backwards. If we're anywhere near achieving Millennium Development Goals, it's because countries like China and India have bootstrapped and curbed poverty. They didn't do it because the Millennium Development Goals told them to do it.
Okay, so would you say that the reason they actually did something like that in the case of chlorofluorocarbons was that the cost in that case were just not that high at a national level? You know, banning aerosols or whatever else is just not nearly as expensive as significantly cutting your carbon fuel emissions. Is that it?
Well, that plus bear in mind that there was also a realization, and this is an extremely important parallel to the climate change situation, there was a realization that, in fact, there's a market for high-tech refrigerators or higher-tech refrigerators that emit fewer CFCs. There was a big profit motive and a big market opportunity in actual compliance. And so you actually open up an entire new market for sub-zero or whatever kinds of refrigerators out there.
Well, yeah, but the reason, but wait a second. I mean, if the market was created by the rules flowing from the treaty, then it's still the treaty that did it. If you're saying that the market existed anyway, independent of the treaty, then you're talking about a case where there was not a problem in the first place. If the market magically solved it.
I absolutely agree that the shadow or fear of longer-term regulation can be a market motivator. That's why Europe has a $1 trillion cap and trade industry right now, without a doubt. So Europe, by laying down consistent rules and putting down the shadow of the future, I mean, you've written a great book about this, so you know exactly what I mean when it comes to game theory. That is part of what has motivated the development of a carbon market in Europe. So yes, could we have a tax policy or other kinds of regulations that would encourage the market to take these steps? Yes, we could. But we don't really have that in the United States so much, and we don't have that on the global level. Europe has what it has because its standards are far higher than anything that would come out of any of these treaties anyway. So I don't see that because there is really no tangible momentum. I mean, Obama went to Copenhagen and these other summits completely toothless because everyone knew he didn't have congressional support. So literally it was just a bad photo op, and you know, at that. So I think we have to realize that, local schemes, regional schemes, market innovation, technology deployment, conservation efforts, these are the things that we need to be doing, not just focusing on global negotiations. Again, I'm not opposed to a global treaty, Bob. There's nothing wrong with having all of these different mechanisms and approaches interlock and work hand in hand and reinforce each other. That would be a beautiful thing and a great way to pursue global governance. But I do not see for the next 5 years or 10 years having one summit after the other where nothing has changed in the intervening years, somehow magically resulting in some kind of binding universal legislation. It's a waste of time until you focus on the other factors like technology and economic reforms.
Okay, I will let that be the last word. You've convinced me I should buy your book and read it. But in the meanwhile, I don't have a copy, so if you have a copy, you should hold it up to the camera for everyone to see. Surely you have a copy.
I do. Here you go. How to Run the World, Charting a Course to the Next Renaissance. Just came out in the last couple of months. Has some nice endorsements, and would appreciate if you all buy it, read it, and debate it.
And I think we should go out with a little more of Tears for Fears here. So thanks a lot, Parag, and good luck with the book.
Thanks so much, Bob. Really enjoyed it. Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.